global impact of President Biden's executive order on critical supply chains. I'm speaking today with Jeff Weiss. He is partner and co-chair of the International Trade Policy Practice and leader of the supply chain team at the law firm of Steptoe Johnson. Hello, Jeff.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me on.
And thanks for coming on too. So give me a large, broad statement on what you think might be the impact of President Biden's executive order on these four critical supply chains.
Well, I think it's going to be very significant. I mean, this is the first serious U.S. government-wide attempt to come up with a supply chain strategy, and they're doing it in their second month in office. So clearly, this is an important issue for the president, and it's an important issue generally. And it's very different from when I was doing supply chain policy in government. I was the port and supply chain lead for Secretary Pritzker at Commerce. And whenever there was a supply chain issue, it was reactive. It tended to be on the logistics side. We would flag it for the White House. The White House would set up an ad hoc process. We'd deal with the issue, and then we'd move on, and then we'd have to reconstitute it if there was another issue. Now they're looking at something much broader, very high level, and it's not just logistics, it's about manufacturing and potentially taking actions that could incentivize changes in supply chains. So there's no immediate effect right now. A lot of work needs to be done, but potentially this could be groundbreaking.
Any of those four particular areas that it covers that might be especially challenging to in terms of strengthening or shoring up those supply chains? We were talking about semiconductors, large capacity batteries, pharmaceuticals, and rare earth elements.
Well, those are the first four, right? So those are the first four in the 100-day review. Mm-hmm. And then I believe there's 6 more that are going to be studied over the course of a year.
Oh, okay. So not stopping there then by any means. Mm-hmm.
No, and it's not just COVID related, as you noted. It's going beyond that. I mean, every sector is going to be different, and I think kudos to the team for realizing that you need sector specific strategies, and then you have a White House driven process because you have NSC and NEC jointly in the lead. But I think they're going to be cross cutting issues. Climate is clearly a cross cutting issue. Cybersecurity. And transportation systems. Mm-hmm. And so, all those things are going to factor into this. Transportation systems in particular is going to impact all of those. And we need a long-term strategy to deal with the port congestion issue. So the issue we're seeing in Southern California right now, I've already seen that a couple of times. I mean, that happens every couple of years. Mm-hmm. And we don't want to have a situation like we have today where you have potential agricultural exports that can't find an available container, right? Where you have 75% of the containers going back to Asia that are empty.
Right.
And it's normally 50. So, I always dealt with it. It was reactive when I was in government. Now it's great that we're trying to get ahead of this. And transportation in particular is something that affects all 4 of the core areas, but also the other 6 areas as well. And the executive order actually reflects that. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I think is really important about the order is it implicitly recognizes that we're not going to be able to onshore or reshore everything. It builds in provisions to collaborate with trusted partners. And I think that's really important. It doesn't mention China. It doesn't talk about foreign adversaries, and it's really about enhancing, U.S. competitiveness. And I think that's where we need to start.
It doesn't mention China, but isn't, in at least a sense, China kind of lurking behind all of these in some ways? I mean, China certainly has dominance in rare earth in a way that we would like to lessen. China has had dominance in medical supplies that we seriously needed during the pandemic, and some, other things too. Is China kind of an implied presence in here, or is that just oversimplifying the whole issue?
No, I do think there's an implied presence. I think that there's a recognition that you can't just address this as a trade issue. Spent a long time at USTR working on WTO issues, including being stationed in Geneva. And the way WTO decision-making works is you need consensus. And so if you're trying to deal with an issue like supply chain, like trade, at the multilateral level, every country has veto power. And so you can't assume you're going to be able to deal with it multilaterally. I know the administration is going to try to deal with state subsidies and state-owned enterprises as part of the push for WTO reform. That's going to take time. It's going to be very difficult, but you have to deal with this as a domestic issue. What are the things that we can do domestically to invest in our workers, to promote innovation, and to rebuild our infrastructure? And we can't have the same strategy as China, right? We don't want to change the business-government relationship in the United States. And I think if you have a crisis like with the pandemic, I think we're all in agreement we want government leadership, like on vaccines over the past 2 months. I think we've seen a huge difference between the administrations on how they have approached that. But a public-private partnership is the way to go. One example, and again, this is different from a top-down approach like we have in China. And this is an example that I talked about recently at a CSIS event. Our standards system is the perfect encapsulation of a public-private sector approach. I used to be on the board of ASTM International, which is the biggest standards developer in the United States, one of the biggest in the world. And they decided they were going to help tackle the shortage of high-quality masks. Mm-hmm. And they developed a mask standard. Again, it's a public-private partnership. So you had FDA, CDC, NIST, Health Canada. You had lots of agencies there to make sure that what came out of that was fit for purpose. You also had the private sector there to make sure it was a performance standard, so lots of different technologies could meet it. They did it in 7 months. They wrote a standard. I mean, rulemaking takes a lot longer than 7 months. And so now there's that standard out there. And if OSHA, for example, were to reference that standard and regulation and say, in workplaces across the country, you need to comply with this mask standard, you've created a major market. And now that you could have a surge in mask production. Mm-hmm. So that's a way our system can help generate solutions to supply chain issues.
But in terms of government action and the potential for perhaps protecting or nurturing domestic industries in response to this 100-day review, is it possible that the actions that the government might take in response to this review could run afoul of WTO, the World Trade Organization, or our trading partners on other fronts and other multilateral agreements? Subsidizing local industries can get us into trouble with our trading partners, could it not?
So it definitely could. And we're going to have to see how that plays out. There are going to be, legislative recommendations made in these reports, regulatory recommendations, procurement recommendations, subsidies, for example. I mean, they're multilateral disciplines on subsidies. I definitely think that, USTR is part of the process, and they're going to be looking to make sure that everything is WTO consistent. At the same time, the WTO consistency of a measure is not going to be what's driving it. What's going to be driving it is how can we enhance our competitiveness? And once we've found something, how do we make that as trade compliant as we possibly can?
And the WTO at this point is not particularly powerful. It's sort of toothless at the moment in terms of its appellate body, thanks to our previous administration's attitude toward WTO, right? I mean, it's not in a position to stop us from doing anything we want to do anyway.
Exactly. So again, there has to be a complainant in the case. Mm-hmm. And if someone were to bring a challenge and the U.S. were to lose at the panel stage, the U.S. could appeal the decision into the void because there's no appellate body. But at the same time, the U.S. has to always be thinking, if I do this, how are trading partners going to react? So that's going to be a practical check. If trade restorative measures are being taken by the U.S., what are others going to do? I mean, climate is a perfect example. We're now moving, we're past the COVID bill. Climate is going to be something that's taken up by Congress even starting this week, and we're looking at potentially, carbon taxes, a clean energy standard, carbon border adjustment mechanism. There are a lot of different possibilities out there, but the question for the administration and for folks on the Hill is, what can we get past? Because this is a huge priority. That's going to be what's driving it, and then figuring out, how do we make this as WTO compatible as possible? Not just because the administration wants to comply, but because we don't want to be retaliated against.
Right.
Right.
Well, but domestically, though, what is the possibility of there being conflicting agendas? Because on one hand, we have an administration that is definitely committed to addressing climate change. On the other hand, One of these four initial industries is rare earth elements, which is considered to be a very, environmentally unfriendly industry. If we seek to increase that presence domestically, do we potentially run up against the agenda for climate change control?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're not going to be able to head off competing policy priorities. That's going to happen. There are going to be policy priorities that are sometimes pulling in opposite directions. And, labor versus environment, I mean, that's a big one. I mean, everyone wants both high levels of environmental protection and jobs with very high wages and great benefits. We've seen this tension in labor's reaction to cancellation of the Keystone Pipeline, right? We're also seeing this on renewables issues, right? If you compare jobs in the energy sector between renewables and non-renewables, and you compare them on wages and unionization levels. So this is going to come into play. So, I mean, ideally, we want policymakers to make evidence-based decisions, transparent decisions, hopefully through rulemaking, taking a cost-benefit approach. But of course, there are going to be political considerations in the mix, as there always are under any administration. I think the president has the right idea when he thinks about climate change, he thinks about jobs, right? And I think to get something big done on climate, we have to get the jobs and competitiveness piece right. I think there are ways, going back to climate, there are ways of doing that, because if you have, let's say, a domestic carbon tax, or even if you have a clean energy standard and a carbon border adjustment mechanism, you're going to be generating a lot of revenue, right? So what do you do with that revenue? You can use that revenue to try to address some of these issues. And because we know that jobs in certain sectors are going to be hurt in the move to a climate change economy, and we need to address that proactively. Not obviously we want to help our workers, but also if we want to get something passed. So it's for both of those reasons.
So many unanswered questions until we see what comes of this initial review. But what is not in dispute is the significance of this executive order and the wide effect that it's likely to have on U.S. industry and trading relations. Jeff Weiss, thank you so much for helping us to understand what some of the elements are that would help us kind of see where this is all going. But thanks for your time today. I really appreciate your insights.
No worries. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.